Okay, so let's talk about the biggest drama queens in your entire body. They're these two tiny pyramid-shaped glands sitting right on top of your kidneys. They're called the adrenal glands, and for their size, they wield an insane amount of power. Think of them as hormonal command centers that can either throw your whole system into overdrive or bring it to a screeching halt. Today, we're diving into the high-stakes world of adrenal disorders.
You know, that sounds like the beginning of a really weird joke, doesn't it? But seriously, the answer connects a hidden presidential illness with some of the most striking, most dramatic signs of hormonal chaos you can imagine. And by the end of this, you'll see exactly how they're all linked.
All right, first things first. Let's get properly introduced to these powerful little structures. They might be small, but as you're about to see, they have a massive say in everything from your blood pressure to how you handle stress from one moment to the next.
So if we were to slice one open, this is what we'd see. You can kind of think of an adrenal gland like an avocado. It's got that big outer layer and then a core on the inside. The outer part, the cortex, makes up a whopping 90% of the gland, and it's basically a busy little steroid factory. The inner 10%, the medulla, that's the core, and it's all about that instant jolt of adrenaline, your fight-or-flight response. For today's story, we're going to be focusing almost entirely on that outer factory, the cortex.
And this factory is a super-organized, three-layer operation. The outermost layer, the zona glomerulosa, is in charge of your salt balance by making a hormone called aldosterone. The middle layer, the zona fasciculata, produces the main character of our story today, cortisol, the stress and sugar hormone. And then that innermost layer of the cortex, the zona reticularis, makes androgens, sex hormones. Now, if you want a great way to remember that, just think go find Rex, GFR, for salt, sugar, and sex. Simple, right?
But here's the thing. The adrenal gland doesn't just go rogue. It takes its orders from the brain, following a very strict chain of command called the HPA axis. The hypothalamus and pituitary glands are like the head office. When they want the adrenal factory to get to work, they send out a really important messenger molecule. It's called adrenocorticotropic hormone, or, much easier, ACTH. You have to remember that name, ACTH. It's going to be the key piece of evidence we track to solve all our medical mysteries today.
Okay, so now we get how the normal chain of command is supposed to work. So what happens when it all goes wrong? Let's dive into our first major disorder, which is what happens when that factory starts working forced overtime and the whole system just goes haywire. This is a condition of excess, a state that puts the body into a constant, relentless overdrive.
And this state of overdrive has a name, Cushing syndrome. Now, this isn't about a single stressful day. This is what happens when your body is basically marinating in high levels of cortisol for a long, long time. And believe me, the effects are dramatic.
And when I say dramatic, I mean it. The physical signs of all this cortisol are unmistakable. See, cortisol essentially tells the body to start remodeling itself. It ramps up fat storage, but in very specific places, causing weight gain right around the trunk, a round moon face, and that classic pad of fat on the back of the neck, which is known as a buffalo hump. At the very same time, it's breaking down protein, which is why you see thin skin, easy bruising, muscle weakness, and those wide purplish stretch marks you see here called striae.
So the big question for doctors is, why is there so much cortisol? And this is where tracking our messenger molecule ACTH is everything. If a pituitary tumor is screaming ACTH at the adrenals, that's called Cushing's disease, and ACTH levels will be high. If some other tumor, maybe in the lung, is pumping out ACTH, we call that ectopic, and ACTH will be very high. But what if the adrenal gland itself has a rogue tumor making cortisol all on its own? Well, the brain sees all that cortisol and shuts down its own ACTH production, so ACTH is low. The same thing happens if you're taking steroid medication. That ACTH level is the clue that tells us exactly where to look for the culprit.
Okay, so that's the story of too much. But what about the exact opposite problem? Let's just flip the script completely and look at what happens when there's too little. This is when the adrenal factory shuts down, leading to a total system failure, with consequences that are just as serious.
And this brings us right back to our first question. President John F. Kennedy secretly battled this very condition, Addison's disease, his entire political life. He was dealing with the profound fallout of his adrenal glands failing him, a secret he managed to keep even while holding one of the most stressful jobs on the planet.
And just like with Cushing's, we have to find the source of the breakdown. In primary adrenal insufficiency, which is Addison's disease, the adrenal glands themselves are destroyed.
The factory is broken. So cortisol is low, but the pituitary is screaming for it to get to work, so ACTH is high. Now, in secondary insufficiency, the factory is fine, but the head office, the pituitary, isn't sending out the ACTH signal. So in that case, both cortisol and ACTH are low. Once again, that ACTH level is the key to the whole mystery.
The signs of this shutdown are a mirror image of Cushing's. Instead of weight gain, you see weight loss and just crushing fatigue. Because that other hormone, aldosterone, is also missing, patients lose salt, they crave it like crazy, and they develop dangerously low blood pressure. And then there's this really peculiar sign. The skin starts to darken.
So, why the dark skin? This is actually a fascinating bit of biochemistry. To make our messenger molecule ACTH, the brain starts with this giant precursor molecule. It's called, and this is a mouthful, pro-opiomelanocortin, or just POMC. Now, when the brain is in a total panic, it starts chopping up tons and tons of this POMC to get more ACTH. But here's the catch. When it does that, it also releases a bunch of another hormone fragment that stimulates melanocytes. Those are the cells that give you a suntan. So, as the pituitary is desperately screaming for cortisol, it accidentally gives the person a tan as a side effect. It's literally a clue written right on their skin.
So we have two conditions that are polar opposites, one of total excess, one of total deficiency. The big question is, how do doctors actually figure out what's going on? Well, this is where the real detective work begins, using some pretty clever tests to poke and prod that HPA-axis chain of command.
To catch Cushing's syndrome, we use something called the dexamethasone suppression test. It's basically a logic puzzle. We give the patient a dose of synthetic cortisol, which is dexamethasone. Now, a normal HPA axis would see this, think, oh great, we've got plenty of cortisol, and it would shut down its own production. But in Cushing's, the thing causing the problem, whether it's a pituitary tumor or an adrenal tumor, it doesn't listen to feedback. It just ignores the signal and keeps on churning out hormones. Cortisol levels stay high. The test fails. Now, to confirm Addison's, we do the complete opposite. We directly challenge the adrenal glands themselves. We give them an injection of synthetic ACTH called Synacthin. We are essentially yelling, get to work, right at the factory. A healthy gland will hear that and respond by pumping out a bunch of cortisol. But in Addison's disease, the glands are damaged. You can shout all you want, but nobody's home. They can't respond. A flat cortisol response confirms the factory has failed.
All right, it's time to put all this knowledge to the test. Let's open our first case file. We've got a 35-year-old man, and he's complaining of weight gain, tiredness, and easy bruising. What's already popping into your head? Okay, now let's look at the evidence from the lab. His baseline plasma cortisol is high. The total amount of cortisol his body made over 24 hours, measured in his urine, is also high. And here's the clincher. When they gave him dexamethasone overnight, his body completely ignored the signal. It failed to suppress cortisol production.
So, what do you think? You've got high cortisol levels that absolutely refuse to be shut down. What's the diagnosis here?
If you said Cushing's syndrome, you nailed it. The diagnosis is clear. And that brings us to the next logical question. We've figured out what the problem is. Now we need to find out why. So, the very next test you'd order is a plasma ACTH level to figure out if the problem is coming from his pituitary, somewhere else, or the adrenal gland itself.
Let's move on to our second case file, which paints a very, very different picture. This is a 24-year-old man with lethargy, weight loss, and this strange dark pigmentation, not just on his skin, but on the inside of his cheeks.
And whoa, look at this lab report. It is striking. His morning cortisol level is critically low. It's practically undetectable. But his plasma ACTH level is sky high, way, way above the normal range. So what story does this pattern tell us?
Well, this lab report perfectly answers our final question. What happens when the body's stress manager completely quits, but the head office just keeps shouting and shouting for it to get back to work? You get Addison's disease. The cortisol factory has gone silent, but the pituitary is just screaming into the void. And it's just a stark reminder of the incredible, delicate balance that these tiny glands control, where a little too much shouting or a little too much silence can change absolutely everything.